Welcome to Inside World Report. I'm Christine Williams. Each week we take political, ethical, or religious issues of significance and we present them for discussion or debate. An ongoing subject we'll soon be presenting to our guests, the separation of church and state. Is it even possible in an absolute sense? If not, then what should and should not be tolerated? We'll be back. Here to discuss the issue of separation of church and state, Paul McKeever, the leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, who is also an employment lawyer, and Farzana Hassan, former president of the Muslim Canadian Congress and also a strong advocate of moderate Islam. Well, Paul, let's start with you. How have you been? Great to have you back with us.
Well, thank you, Christine. It's been a real pleasure. Been very busy recently politically, and it's great to address this topic.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just got by those Ontario elections.
That's right.
What about you, Farzana? How have things been?
I've been well. It's been a busy summer, but I'm glad to be back on CTS.
Glad to have you back. Now, getting right into this issue of separation of church and state, it is huge. And what we're doing actually is that we're going to bounce off a particular article that really highlights the essence of what we're facing here. If we could look at that first article here, okay? It's Supreme Court hears religious hiring case. Now, this issue is of significance to both of you for several factors here, but here you have in a nutshell a lady. She's working for a Lutheran organization. And when you look at religious rights and freedoms, when you look at how church organizations have been handled, there's been a sort of an allowance for them to function how they may. Now, the church has its own due process. And what happened here was that this lady threatened to sue this organization over a discrimination issue based on narcolepsy that she had, and there was some kind of an issue there going on between both organizations. But her point was, this is my right. Their point was, you didn't follow due process, because according to Christian principle, we're supposed to be sorting this out among ourselves. So it goes to court, and now it's head-to-head. And another major issue that comes up that highlights this, for example, in religious organizations, many of them have a system in place where you sign a document when it comes to your conduct, with how you dress, all of this going together. And I'm going to start with you on this one, Paul.
Well, it seems to me that the Lutheran organization here is in the right. And I'm not speaking as a lawyer and under Ontario law. This is actually a United States situation. But just in terms of the principles, I mean, you've got a situation where, but for this law that would give her some sort of right with respect to narcolepsy, the church would be within its right to decide who they should hire, who they should fire. Keep in mind, I mean, an employment relationship is a contractual relationship, and it's for the two parties to decide who they want to enter into that relationship with. The payer decides who they want to give their money to and what kind of services they want. And the person providing the services decides whether or not the money being offered is enough and whether it's the kind of organization they want to work for. It seems to me that what's happened here is not so much that religion has intruded, but that what they call human rights or civil rights or employment rights, largely manufactured, not natural rights, have created a situation where the freedom of religion is being intruded upon.
Yes, okay. Your position on this, Farzana?
Well, I would tend to agree with Paul on this issue, and I think that churches and synagogues and mosques and religious organizations in general do need to have a certain degree of autonomy. You know, they're familiar with their own sort of religious rules and regulations and whatnots, and they know what their requirements are. So yes, they are entitled to a degree of autonomy. However, I will also go so far as to say that when it comes to human rights issues, and there have been human rights issues, when it's been an issue of dismissal or hiring and firing policies, and that certain human rights have been violated, and in that case, governments do have the right to intervene. I mean, governmental intervention, I think, is warranted when there is that danger of certain human rights being violated. I'm not fully aware of the antecedents of this particular case, but as a broad principle, I think that governments do need to step in at a certain point.
But you see, it's that point that we're trying to establish here when it comes to her particular rights. Now, Cheryl Parrish is particularly arguing that her rights were violated under the Disabilities Act or whatever it is they call it in the United States. But it goes something like this. She has narcolepsy. Her doctor approves her going back to work, and they have some issues. Is she really ready to come back to work as a teacher and function the way she should, according to what they expect as employers. Now, once again, the whole issue here is the church due process. Now, another example that was brought up is, for example, the Catholic Church. They don't hire women as priests. Now, does that pose an issue as to discrimination against women?
It would pose an issue for me. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, to me it would not. That's, again, a situation of the private sphere versus the public sphere. When we're talking about this Lutheran organization, or when we're talking about a Catholic organization, these are voluntary organizations. No one has to belong to them. Nobody has to work for them. The terms are set by the organization. We have a position available. These are the terms. If you don't like it, don't take the position. That, morally speaking, to me is the right way to go. And in that respect, as long as we maintain that distinction between private and public sector, religion is protected from government intrusion, wrongful government intrusion. The purpose of government in that private sector is limited to defending the life, liberty, and property of everyone involved, including the property of the church in that case. They shouldn't be forced to give their money to someone who doesn't want to accept the terms of the offer of employment. Okay,
we're going to have to go for a break very soon, but here both sides presented in a very stark way. Okay, the University of Virginia law professor Douglas Laycock, this is what he says, that the church has really no place in government business, but he also says the government has no place in church business. Whereas the Reverend, ironically, Barry Lynn, he happens to be the executive director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. He's saying something quite different here, because he's talking about religious liberty and ministerial exceptions, and he's saying, well, when you look at those principles, it could present a case where the rights of individuals are being violated. And I think that's where we end up with a serious problem here, trying to find out where that balance lies. We're going to go for a break. We'll be back after this to continue our discussion of separation of church and state. Welcome back to Inside World Report. We're talking about separation of church and state today. Now, Farzana, I want to pick you back up on what you were saying earlier, that you have an issue with the Catholic Church, for example, not having women as priests.
Exactly, I do. And in fact, I have issues with, you know, certain beliefs and practices within my own religious community when it comes to women's equality. I think that religious communities now need to bring their beliefs and practices in line with 21st century sensibilities and expectations, you know, which mean that they need to uphold gender equality in an absolute sense or in a full sense. And I don't see that happening in the Catholic Church. I don't see that happening in my own, you know, Islamic community. And I have always had issues with that. So I think that that would constitute a human rights issue for me. And I think that in that particular situation, I think governments do need to intervene. I can give you the example of, for example, the issue with the mosque and, you know, the 400 students getting together in the cafeteria of the school and turning it into a mosque during lunchtime. And the issue I have with that is that the women or the girls are sent right in the back. There is that sort of gender discrimination, and I'm asking the government to step in and do something about that.
Okay, now what you said there is very critical, because we have a history, we have a tradition, and we're a multicultural society where various cultures are coming in. And listening to Farzana, she has an issue with women being how they're treated within her own culture. So how, as a progressive society, how do we incorporate multiculturalism and also be fair across the board in relationship to tradition, yet at the same time try to balance this with the law?
Well, I think first of all, there's a difference between having multiple cultures within a society and multiculturalism properly defined. I think multiculturalism is actually a very harmful ideology which says that there are no values, no moral values of any kind, nothing's to be judged better or worse. It's a socialist attempt to basically move the economy to the left. But apart from the multiculturalism argument, I'd say that the thing you do not want to do is get the government involved in dictating religion or religious beliefs or religious practices, because at that point, they have to pick one. And you're pretty much stuck with, first of all, one religion, the one that the government picks. You know, in England, it's been the Anglican Church. And you're stuck also, I think, with the danger that what you might have hoped would be a moral system or a accommodating system, a system that tolerates many different religions, will become very intolerant. So that separation of church and state becomes very important for the protection not only of people who don't want to be involved with religion, but people who have a religion that they don't want to see tampered with or prevented by the government.
Yes, yes, go ahead, Farzana.
Well, I mean, I think in secular democracies, and the UK is a secular democracy, you know, Canada is a secular democracy, and the whole idea behind secularism is that you have neutrality towards the different, you know, faith traditions living within that same polity. So I don't know if it's a question of picking one particular religion. However, I think that within certain subcultures in Canada, I think there are practices that the government does need to pay attention to. For example, female genital mutilation. And there are so many other practices, you know, like child brides and so forth. And
do you believe in tradition, Farzana? Do you believe in tradition?
If it's good.
If you look at our Judeo-Christian democracy,
good.
There's a tradition attached. Do you believe in that?
Well, I mean, you know, if tradition treats everybody equally, yes, then I would believe in tradition.
Is it possible, though, to have
are
absolute separation of church and state? Now you've been, when it comes to issues of Sharia law, Islamic jurisprudence, you've been one of the leaders. The Muslim Canadian Congress has. And when Sharia law came close to coming into Ontario, the Muslim Canadian Congress stood up to that tooth and nail,
yes,
so to speak. So you are all for separation of church and state based on those ideologies and understanding what Islamic jurisprudence is about. But would you say that given the tradition of our democracy, that absolute separation of church and state is possible?
Well, you know, it depends on what you mean by absolute. If you mean that a religion should be able to do things that we would consider a violation of a person's life, you know, human sacrifice, of course not. Violating a person's liberty, chaining them up because they didn't, you know, do the right ritual, or taking their property away as a punishment of some sort because that's what the religion indicates. Clearly, none of those things are appropriate, even in the private sphere. That's what the government's there to do, to make sure that nobody is deprived of their life, of their liberty, or their property without their consent.
So it's a big issue of human rights. That's fundamental. Now, there's another issue when it comes to separation of church and state that I want us to address here, and this one is highlighted in our second article, where teachers not allowed to bow heads, to pray silently by the school board. Now, this was a situation, again, the issues that we highlight here, they're applicable across the board. This is a school, and this incident happened in Tennessee. It was a school that during See You at the Pole event, this is a global movement, a prayer rally that Christian students do, where they gather together on campuses and they pray. Well, they were being supervised by the teachers, and while they were praying, the Christian teachers felt, well, I'm going to bow my head in unison and pray too. But the coaches, because a team also did that, a sports team, were taken aside by the administration and told, look, you can't do this, okay? The ACLU is going to be basically breathing down our throats, okay? That's what's been that's what's been going on, because the ACLU wants to see an absolute separation of church and state, particularly when it comes to practicing forms of religion in the school system. So they said, no bowing allowed. They were actually told that if you bow with the students, you're allowed to supervise them, but you're not allowed to bow your head. If you do this, your job is in jeopardy. What do you think of that?
Well, here we have the opposite sphere. We're looking at the public sphere now. So this was a public school, and because it is a public school, it's funded by the taxpayer, it's run and owned by the government. The government has this obligation in a democracy not to be accountable to anyone except the people it governs. It's not accountable to anyone's God. It's not accountable to anybody except the governed. That's what makes it a democracy, you know, a thing that a government gets its power from the people, as opposed to, say, a theocracy, which a government gets its power, for example, from God. So that exercise, what they've done is, by entering into the education field, which they probably ought never to have done in the first place, they've put themselves in a situation where some people who would be able to express their religious beliefs within a private school system now want to do it in a public school system, and that puts the school in the service of a god. It makes the state look as though it's in the service of a god or of a religion. And at that point, I think it's appropriate for the school to say, well, since we are a government school, that's not our job, and we have to put these rules in place that say, don't even appear to be you know, accountable or in the service of anyone's God.
Now, Farzana, I'm going to pick you up on this, but first we have to go for a break. But food for thought on that break, there's a tradition here, and there has been a lot of bad blood and a lot of people disgruntled that prayer was taken out of school in the first place. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to our discussion, separation of church and state, and we're going to pick it back up with that story that we were discussing, the See You at the Pole event. Now, The parents of the students weren't that happy. In fact, they had a town hall meeting where some 1,200 of them showed up, and it was quite the rally. One lady said, and there you have it on your screen there, that look, I don't care if they take me to jail. I'm not gonna stop fighting this. They were angry. The entire crowd chanted, "Amen." So they're ready for a fight here. Take it away, Farzana.
Yeah, well, I, as you know, am a staunch secularist, which means I believe in a strict sort of separation of religion and state. But even I think that that's ridiculous, you know, bowing your heads and barring that teachers from doing that. I think that that's ridiculous. I think that's...
To bar the teachers?
Yes, I think that's going...
Why do you think it's ridiculous? Tell me why you think it's going too far. There's a balance that I'm trying to capture here.
I think that people need to understand the distinction between respecting and endorsing, and I think that the government is saying that they're endorsing this particular religion or this particular denomination and so forth. I think that in order to show respect, you don't necessarily have to also endorse something, and I think that that's what you know, people need to understand here. And you know, this is just being done in their private time. It's not you know, being sponsored by the school or anything. And I think that's just going too far.
Mm-hmm. See, now I would draw the line differently. Now, Farzana has made the line between endorsement and respect. I would draw the line between, on the one hand, endorsement and respect, and on the other hand, tolerance. I think that schools, publicly owned, government-owned schools, do need to be tolerant. But I don't think that they should imply respect for any particular set of beliefs, religious beliefs.
But does this not fall in the line of tolerance? I mean, you look at it with another religion. Let's say a bunch of Muslim students during their break was celebrating their prayer, and some of the Muslim teachers just happened to bow their head. I don't think people would have an issue with that.
Probably not.
I don't think they would.
Well, I think in our public schools, you know, we celebrate Diwali, we celebrate Eid, and, you know, as long as, you know, we're celebrating everything, we are maintaining that neutrality towards every single faith tradition. And I think that, you know, if Christian students in this school are allowed to do that, and if teachers are showing respect, I don't have issues with that.
But you see, we seem to be, as a society, having a major problem here when it comes to drawing lines of what's considered reasonable accommodations and what's considered not, to the point where Christians now are being seen as not being accommodated. Plus, we have lobby groups that are against any form of Christianity in the schools. Now, you look at this, what's being called now mosqueteria.
Yes.
In Toronto, in the Toronto school. You're very much against that. Now, if you look at the See You at the Pole event, this one you see as something quite different.
I see this as different. But you know, my issue with the mosqueteria thing is the gender discrimination that takes place. And I don't see that happening in this particular circumstance where you have the Christian students praying and the teachers bowing their heads. I don't see that happening
we're being
there.
fair.
And,
well, I'm going to disagree.
You're going to disagree.
Yeah, no, I don't think that even student organizations should be using schools for things like organized demonstrations of prayer and et cetera. I don't think that's the proper use of government property. The concern, of course, it's always going to be a matter of you know it when you see it. If it looks as though the teachers are coordinating a religious exercise, an organized religious exercise, I think that's when they, in a public school, that's when it crosses the line. Surely it's the case that a child should be free to pray, I mean, in a public school or a private school. The question is whether it's an organized religious event and whether the government, in other words, the school owner, is sponsoring it, etc., or suggesting to the students. I don't think
that, you see, they weren't.
But it might even go so far as, when we respect anything, what that means is we value. To respect is to value. And if there's something, for example, a religious belief or a religion that is utterly against your morality or your religion, you don't want to say that you respect that. You can't respect that and be true or have integrity.
I agree with you 100%. I'm not sure we're not on the same page here. I agree with you 100%. And I think that was Farzana's point too.
You can respect something at the, or not respect something at the intellectual level, and yet, you know, be civic-minded enough to show that respect, you know, when you're in a public space together with other individuals who espouse a different type of a belief system. And I don't think that that's necessarily saying that you don't believe in your own morality. It's just a question of, you know, entering into a social contract when you're among a number of different people with a number of different beliefs.
See, that's what I would call tolerance, though. I would call that toleration rather than respect. I mean, you're saying I don't agree with you, but I'm civil and I'm respecting your freedom to do what you're doing.
But you see, that's why the Christians were offended, because they felt that this was the student freedom of having the See You at the Pole event. It's not like that's not what I gathered, that they were skipping class to go to it, or that the teachers were ducking out of class and evading their responsibility. It was a free event, and they simply bowed their heads, I couldn't see the harm there. And back to the whole separation of church and state, because I know that there are aggressive groups trying to make it absolute, although it's in our Constitution, the supremacy of God, and it's on the, again, the US dollar. Now, we have a situation that we're going to be showing our audience here soon where David Cameron called for faith groups to pray, to bring back some kind of a sense of right and wrong in society, particularly considering what Britain saw this summer. We'll be back to talk about it after this. Welcome back to Inside World Report, talking about separation of church and state. Now, the British Prime Minister came out and said that religious leaders are needed to set the way for right and wrong. So he called for religious involvement and a promotion of that kind of a behavior, ethic, from faith communities.
Well, again, my concern is you can't just say go out and do religious things because all religious things are necessarily moral. You can't just say have faith and no matter what you're having faith in, it will be moral. So I think it's misguided. I also don't think it's appropriate for a political leader to invoke, you know, religion. It's not the role of the state. The role of the state is rather to say we're going to defend you no matter what your beliefs are, as long as you don't violate anyone's life, liberty, and property. For him to come out and say, embrace faith and do what your religious leaders say, some of what he might get in response isn't exactly a respect of life, liberty, and property. It might, in fact, be quite the opposite. So
we have very little time here, but I'm going to pose this final question. We have a tradition, okay? Our country, the United States, basically all Western democracies are based on a Judeo-Christian democracy. Do you have any respect, or is there anything to say in terms of honoring that tradition?
Absolutely. I think all religions say don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie. And I think that religious communities can do more, you know, to tell their youth to abstain from these things.
I think reason is what tells us what's good and bad, not oldness or staleness.
Where do we get our reasoning from? We can't separate ourselves from the doctrines that come from our upbringing and our teaching.
Well, you know,
the golden rule.
You've got your five senses and you've got your logical mind. And even, you know, slavery used to be respected, and we don't take that as something that's good now just because it used to be a tradition. So we have to be wary about the fact that something is a tradition doesn't necessarily make it good.
But do you agree, though, that we cannot have total separation of church and state? Otherwise, we have to change that first line in the Constitution.
I think in the sense that religion will be curtailed from violating life, liberty, and property, no, we can't have a separation.
On that level.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's fair. Any final words there, Farzana?
No, I think that you can't have a complete separation of religion and state because of that. That's a big
well, thank you
there.
both so much for joining us on our maiden show. And that's all the time we have. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.